We'll jump right in. Hello, Compass team.
Hello.
All right. Well, with me, listeners, I have, of course, the usual and the wonderful Greg Rucka, and
Yes,
no stranger
thug,
to the podcast.
Yeah, standard thug role.
Yes, but I am excited to be joined by Robert and Dave, where you guys are in Australia, so this is going to be really thrilling for the audience to get all that Australia authenticity.
I will hope that it is as exciting as the Northern Hemisphere would want. As you can probably all see, I'm coming to you live from my car because I have a 4-year-old inside on a Sunday morning, and it's a mere 17 degrees Celsius now. I can't do the Fahrenheit. Somebody will need to convert that. But over the course of this interview, it's going to get progressively hotter. So if I start to melt in my sealed car, I will feel I have communicated the full Australian experience to you.
You
just need a spider in the back, just lurking over your shoulder, and you'd have the whole thing.
Well, now I've actually had the pleasure of going to Australia, and everybody was just wonderful. And my husband and I totally love the country and are excited to one day be able to go back if you will let Americans back into the country there. But
I am almost certain you'll be the first permitted, give or take. So, the doors will open once more eventually. Everybody seems to have defaulted right now to the let it rip position. So after some 18 months of suppressing all entries at all costs, we've sort of given up the ghost for good, or more appropriately for ill. But that does give us the side effect of, people who we have missed will get to come across again. And hopefully, you'll be able to come down and join us.
Yes. And, off air, we were all talking, we are crossing several time zones here. So it's a lot of math and things that we're not going to discuss, but I am here obviously to talk to you about this wonderful, I've got it with me. Thank you so much, about this wonderful comic Compass. And I'm super excited when Greg reached out because I had started it. And of course, life is a little crazy, but I am finished now. And I had really enjoyed the read. And I want to talk about kind of this collaboration and kind of the in the beginning type of story. Have you? So tell me about the journey of how we literally got here, but obviously the journey of Compass, because I know I read some in the letters and everything and the editor's notes, but I'd love to kind of hear your take on it. Cause like I said earlier, pre-roll, there was all this banter going on. So I know this is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm gonna leap on that first, just so the people hearing / watching don't go, why is Rucka there again? Because I'm going to try to exhibit some uncharacteristic restraint and keep my mouth somewhat shut this time. But my presence here is because I made them do this. It wasn't severe arm twisting. Like, it wasn't as if they said comics, why would anybody want to write a comic? But Compass is the first time in over 25 years of working in comics where I literally was presented with not just creators, but an idea from creators that got me so excited that I was like, we got to figure out a way to do this. So my presence is producerial, and acting as their rabbi, I think, in many aspects to this. But I think it's always important to me to make it clear this was theirs. And I rode them like workhorses, and wasn't shy about my editorial notes. But all that being said, what you've read, the book that's out there now, The Trade, as drawn by Justin Greenwood, is the project as created by Justin and Robert and Dave. This is theirs. It's just one of those things that I was passionate about, that I've believed in from the start, and that I continue to believe in, and that I hope will lead to more. So And that's my origin story. Now you can add. So
Right. We'll see if it adds up.
all right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to say, after the check cleared, Greg agreed to say all these loving. No, I'm just. So
Don't time that on the drink, man. Don't time that on the swallow. Otherwise, it's all over the camera.
That's
and the
okay. This is
mic
going to be
and-
our 30-second snippet that I use for promo.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Just slow motion kind of arterial spray. So Robert and I, Dave and I were on we're working on another project, or had just finished working on another project, which Greg was aware of. And just as we had downed pens on an opening for it, so we'd had some pages together and we were in talks with people. I won't specify what the project was because hopefully someday we'll return to it. But at that exact moment, effectively an identically premised book came out. And so they'd clearly been 6 months ahead of us, but we just went, this is going to absolutely scarper what we were going to do in the first instance. And so we were somewhat despondent, and we'd spent a lot of time and energy in it around day jobs and crying into our pretzels, as we all want to do. Greg kind of came around with a rally round pitch and said, well, what else are you guys thinking about? What else are you passionate about? Really, if you were going to go for anything, what would you be doing? And we'd been talking about Compass on and off at that point for the better part of a decade. So the genesis of the idea, and I think we've talked about this in interviews before, is when, amongst other things, when Disney bought Indiana Jones along with Star Wars, and that's many moons ago now, though it doesn't feel entirely as far back as it must be. You know, the idea of, as in fact they are now doing, trotting Harrison Ford out at, you know, the age of 80 or whatever it is, to do another one of these, felt like they were approaching a point of diminishing returns, with all the love in the world to Mr. Ford. And
to the franchise, frankly.
Yeah. Having heard that news, I'm like, I understand what they're trying to go for, but surely the idea of pulp adventure, as it were, is not confined to one particular era or one particular milieu or one particular person. Maybe we should be thinking about other ways to do that. How could that be done? And that suggested Shahida immediately. And this was also on a Sunday morning like today, and probably about 10 o'clock. And I was down here in Melbourne, where I now live, but didn't at the time. I was staying with my in-laws. And when such concepts occur to me, I do what I always did, which is that I called Dave and went, hey, I'm thinking about something. And he immediately fired back, well, what we need to manage that is the character who became Ling. And so from that first 10-minute phone call a decade ago, we were vaguely off and running. And then we had sketched out what was probably what became, under Justin's pen, the first 8 or 9 pages of that first issue as an opening sequence long before we backed out the rest. So I know I've sort of started mentioning characters, and we haven't done a layout of the book or anything for any of your listeners who don't know what it is or why they should read it. But I've also spoken now anecdotally for like 5 minutes, so I'm going to be quiet a little bit, but that's certainly the genesis of it.
Okay, so I'll ask you, Dave, like, you know, you got that phone call and clearly you work together a lot and create, you know, at that jumping off point, did you feel like, oh, this will be 10 years down the road? Or did you think like this project was going to, you know, take off right away? Or did you expect to be where you're at now?
I don't think we're that practical a set of people. You know, my immediate thought when he called up and went, okay, 13th century House of Wisdom treasure hunting adventure, I didn't go, how long will this take before it hits the shelves? I went, okay, what's happening in the 13th century? So Mongols, you've got expansionists. It's only a brief amount of time before Baghdad burns. How far can a person travel away on foot you could probably reach Wales in a few years with a lot of luck. You know, and you just go from there. By the time you turn around and say, what actually is this project? You're so far down that road through the conversation that Robert's being called out of the room to go to whatever Sunday event he's got. And I'm sitting there going, okay, let's start sketching some dialogue, worrying about bits and bobs. And that's why it comes on and off the shelf over and over again over the years, because good ideas that you resonate with and think you can do something entertaining with and think have something to say. You know, it doesn't matter whether you've worked out the form or even the medium yet necessarily. You can always just kind of, your mind goes back and tinkers to them. And when you've got friends like Robert and Greg to bounce those ideas off, you'll find it keeps happening. And then that's how you know that sooner or later you'll do something with it.
Yeah, and I've heard that. I've had the pleasure of speaking with many amazing comic creators, and these characters resonate and like, you know, spark, and then years down the road they show up again, or it's just a matter of timing. And just for our listeners now, whoever would like to like maybe kind of share a little bit about, you know, what this project or what Compass is, and now that we kind of have a little bit of a backstory, maybe kind of share a little bit about that narrative.
Yeah, I think we've kind of set the big picture in bits and pieces. It's a treasure hunt in the 13th century where rival treasure hunters coming from Baghdad and from further east respectively are chasing across Wales looking for the cauldron of eternal life. You know, and it is their adventures with traps and old ruins and fights in burning buildings and incomplete churches as they try to get their hands on the prize.
And monsters. Don't forget giant monsters.
Monsters and ghosts
in
and
there.
assassins. Like we
Yes.
basically
And
crammed it
bad
full of
guys
all the pulpy stuff we love. Yes.
And what
Yeah.
I love is you've already mentioned the Indiana Jones comparison. I saw one of your audience, you know, readers also kind of wrote in and was like, oh, it kind of gave me that nostalgia. So clearly that was obviously a source of inspiration. And that's the first thing I think when Greg, you know, way back had talked to me about it, was like, yeah, except our heroine, and that already had me, you know, hooked, right? Our heroine is, you know, not your typical like indie character, and also her frenemy, I guess you could call it, Ling. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, you know, you just mentioned, oh, if we have Shahida, then Ling is clearly the counterpart. I'd love to hear about why that dynamic, and tell our listeners a little bit about those two characters.
So I'll start, and then Dave or even Greg, if you want to jump in and either edit or correct as we go. I think that'll be a fair way to assess it.
That's Greg's job, after all.
Distinctly. You know, we have, I should say, an excellent official editor, Alejandro Abona, who did sterling work on the book and brought it together. But he was he did an editor's job, as I said, in an excellent fashion, but he was perhaps slightly less robust, not knowing us as well as Greg, who would call us and kick our butts when necessary. And I'm sure, should we rub it on too much, he will be willing to do so again. But so the characters
they recently got a note from me that there was a comment in a document they sent me that literally said, I don't know which of you is responsible for this, but whichever one it is needs to go outside right now, because shame on you for writing this.
Yeah.
Like, you know what you did. So that might give you the idea of the editorial relationship. I feel very paternal to these young men.
Clearly, I was going to say, we know what kind of parent Greg is.
Yes. What was that, for young or paternal?
Yeah.
What was the air quotes for?
It's just, you know, what's funny about that, and we're getting away from your question maybe, but it's something that I always enjoy sort of visiting on, is that Dave and I lose track very rapidly of who wrote what. There is not a point where we go, you did these 12 and I did these 12 and we swapped over. And people often relatively often tell us that they can't tell the difference between the authorial voice, and that's
which is
not
excellent.
an accident but also
Yeah.
is an emergent property of how we write, which is that we constantly write over each other to the point that it's now some bizarre two-headed frog of an entity. And so we will never know who bears the shame for whatever we did.
That sounds a little suspicious to me.
Yeah, they both got sent into the corner.
Right. So basically, you both take the fall.
So, yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So the characters, you know, as I said before when we were talking about the genesis of the idea, the concept started and to an extent therefore suggested who the characters were and would be. And so if you know what you want to do is a pulpy adventure style treasure hunt, one of the reasons why Indiana Jones and that kind of 30s narrative is so dominant in that space is the idea of a race for a prize like that, particularly an archaeological prize, which is the most common way of doing it, but any form of that kind of treasure hunting or treasure recovery is often prompted by the periods of great exploration that contained that in history, which is why the period from sort of the rise of Egyptology in the mid 19th century to really the point of the mid 20th century, where we started to rightly think maybe it's not a good idea to take all these things to the British Museum. And then a good 20 to 30 years of getting from maybe it's not a good idea to, yeah, no, it's probably not a good idea, kind of tapers off that framework for this kind of story. And that means that when you're talking about world history, there is a suggestion that if you want to do that type of story, you've probably only got a 60 to 80 year framework to operate in. And one of the things that we wanted to do conceptually is blow that idea wide open, that the only time of recovery and exploration and the scientific rigor that's brought to these things, but also the lack of, I guess, scientific distance and technological armament that we bring to them now, was this period between 1880 and 1950. And that therefore led to the House of Wisdom almost immediately. It's probably a version of this that we could have done with, mid 17th century pirates rolling around, because that's the other great genre for treasure hunt. And maybe we'll get back there in some capacity one way or another. But, we both knew about the House of Wisdom in general as students of history. And we knew that amongst other things, centered around a golden age of cartography, which suggested exploration, and it also dealt hugely with the recovery of pre-Middle Age documents, so the ancient masters as they called them then, and that therefore meant a facility for languages and a kind of cultural understanding of the wider world. We knew that Baghdad obviously was in the center of a trade route, and as a consequence had a melange of various cultures moving through it. All of that suggested the kind of cosmopolitan environment, the modernist environment, if you like, from which somebody can depart to explore. And then knowing that the House of Wisdom did permit female scholars and female Islamic scholars, and very conscious that at this point in the 21st century, if you are telling a story centered around the Muslim world as it then was, particularly during this kind of medieval period, moving into Europe, that was going to come to the general audience with preconceptions of what a Muslim scholar adventurer might be like. And the first thing that we sort of went is, well, time to make sure they understand that all of those preconceptions are basically wrong. And that suggested that she would be young, that she would be a woman, that she would be very comfortable as a traveler, and that she would, even though this is not historically accurate to a significant degree, but frames the historical accuracy, if you like, that the idiom in which she operates when written would be modern. So this is not a book, as you will know, where we write like it is the early 13th century. We write like it is the 21st century, and the goal behind that is to make sure that it's never exoticized. The point about Baghdad in this story, which doesn't appear, but characters come and go through it, and so it's a point of reference, is that it is not a strange or wondrous place in that sense, although it obviously has its own charms. It is the center point. You're supposed to be putting yourself in the position of someone from the city because that's the closest to the modern context that we can understand it. And that is supposed to make us turn, and hopefully we somewhat succeeded in doing that, turn the idea of what is central to the narrative of world history on its head. And that's why Wales becomes this exotic, challenging, dangerous, wild place.
And one of the things that I think, just hooked me when it was laid in front of me was there is enough historical factual basis to build everything else on. So that it's not a historical travelogue, that its nods to historical accuracy are done, I think it's fair to say with full respect and intent. But it's not, there's nothing polemic in it. It is still all, it is never not an adventure story. And I love the fact that it is this rollicking adventure story with protagonists that certainly in the US, if not in, Western Europe, have been largely, I won't say edited out, but overlooked.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I always find it interesting because one is and I think Greg knows this, I'm kind of obsessed with the Mongols anyway, because my husband made me listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, Wrath of Khan, and he's listened to it like 20 times. And then I saw all the books and the references, and so that was exciting as it was, and it always makes it interesting. But I find and wonder if when you're doing something like historical fiction, do you get down that rabbit hole? Okay, how accurate do you want to be historically? You want to do, like what Greg was saying, kind of a nod to it, but then at the same time, it's fiction and you're creating the story. Did you find challenges in just ending up doing so much history? I mean, clearly you both know a lot about history, or at least love it, in order to kind of have so many elements that are woven in. What was that, research like, and how did that kind of play into where the story went? And did you ever find yourself derailing and going too far deep into the history side, or in terms of like the story and research?
We definitely went down a lot of rabbit holes with the research. We were eager and diligent and sometimes a little obsessive. Justin, who's the other part of the work, who's not speaking here today, was very, very good about bringing us back to the practicality. From Robert and my perspective, the rule was always kind of, you need to earn your ghosts and dinosaurs with the work. And I think Justin had the very wise perspective that, no, you need to earn the detailed historical asides with your ghosts and dinosaurs, because I have to draw this stuff. And I think that made for a really good kind of balance of what you see on the page. It's about, the history is there to set a context for the adventure, and the adventure is there to draw you into the history, and it's got to be that sort of two-hander. Mongols are great. I share your interest deeply and have strong views on their representation.
Okay.
In that, I hate the word horde being applied. I think it's ridiculous. We are talking about a historic global superpower that was the largest land empire the world's basically ever seen, that lasted the longest of any of the contiguous political units of the time. I'm not one to cheer for hegemonic global superpowers. They tend to do very, very bad things. This is one that does very, very bad things.
And they did.
They did horrible things.
Oh, yeah.
Just like every empire that's
right.
colonizing a huge chunk of the world. And so they're not by any means the heroes of this piece. They are emphatically our villains. But in the context of bad people who have a large army and a large reach, taking the things they want, not because there's something especially barbaric about the Mongolian people or some brutal primal fierceness in their blood. It's just, they've got power, they want more power, and they know where to get it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That goes actually really well to your earlier question about the dynamic between Shahida and Ling, which is that the minute you start placing yourself in the shoes of these people and giving them, you want to build somebody who is going to run down an ancient barrow and fight a dinosaur in order to recover a big shiny cauldron that gives you eternal life. But if you want to take a premise that is relatively far out and go, no, I want to give this person a core of emotional truth, then you have to think about them as a person, qua person. And that meant that in order to have the classic kind of treasure hunters race where two people are after things and betraying each other or working together or managing the uneasy tension of getting it, their motivations for wanting it needed to be real. And that suggested a lot of things about their personal dynamics, about how they approach treasure and knowledge and adventure. And once you have those, you have that tension, but you also have the similarities. And even though, as Dave said, the Mongols are the villain of the piece here, we've tried to be careful to make sure that every character, including the villains, has psychological realism. And some of the classic depictions of Mongols have lacked that. They've been much more big furry hat, scary eyes kind of look. And that's not at all what we wanted to do by any stretch of the imagination.
I'm always interested in treasure hunts. I did not really participate in many of them as a child. I think maybe I was just more forbidden and, strict Kung Fu family. Like, no, you're not going on treasure hunts. But
you had training to do.
I had training to do. Yeah, there was no time for this type of thing. But is that something? Because I always imagine, like, you see movies like Goonies and even, just a lot of these fun movies where I always saw other kids doing treasure hunts. Was that something you participated in as a child or as an adult? And, no judgment, but is that like, does that come into play where, you're creating this world? Is it because from personal experience or something you've always loved to do or love to research about or read about?
So we had to retitle the book because it wasn't originally called Compass for various reasons. And when I mentioned the new title to my wife, she laughed for about 10 minutes because a running joke in our household, as Dave has heard multiple times, is that I occasionally am called the Compass because I have zero sense of direction, like none. So I will get lost within a block and a half of my house driving around at night. I've got no spatial awareness whatsoever. So I certainly had to do, orienteering at school, and I guess it must be a very Australian thing. They drop you in the middle of the bush and kind of go, all right, you got to find 35 points and get back to base camp and all the rest of that thing. But that was not fun so much as a nightmarish wandering through eternal circles for me.
Oh my goodness.
I guess,
so wait, they drop you where? How far out are you?
Well, we don't do summer camps here in the way that you guys do, because summer is not our big period of holiday. Because it is our big period of holiday, but we don't do the school thing where it breaks up for like 8 weeks. It's Christmas time because it's summer right now, effectively. And that is the point where business is shut down, but it's only a little break for the school. So we do little breaks over the course of the year. The reason that is important context for this is that school camps therefore have a very different meaning to them. So that experience where, at least pop culture tells me, American kids kind of go to some place out in the woods where they all have cabins and stuff like that. We tend to do smaller groups and we rough it a little more. And so where I was educated was in Queensland, which is where Dave and I met. And so we would travel probably 4 to 5 hours out from the cities into relatively unspoiled kind of rainforest country. And then they would be like, all right, well, these are your 4 days of various things you've got to do with hiking and bushwalking and packing and all that sort of thing.
Oh, wow.
So
and wait,
that may be a quirk of.
Were there adults there too? Or, I mean,
there
how
were
old were
adults.
you? Okay. So, I was like, just imagining like a bunch of kids getting drunk.
Yeah, it's like just being shoved out, being like,
yeah, like slowing down the van barely and be like, all right, good luck. Here's your compass.
Even saying that, although it's not quite that extreme, I will suggest that perhaps for the people who run these things, there's a slightly more laissez-faire attitude to child safety than you might initially anticipate. So I went to what I guess you'd call in the States an all boys prep school.
Okay.
And that was, you know, when you're 13 or 14, they did just kind of drop like 60 14-year-old boys in the woods with one person to be in charge of them. And
Right.
that does not a safe environment necessarily lead to when everyone's got knives and you're out in the darkness kind of trying to make your way. So I guess the spirit of adventure has curdled in me somewhat. Would be the best way I can put it.
I'll cure it right quick, I guess. It'll either make it or break it.
Well, it sounds
Okay.
traumatizing. I mean, I'm not a nature person, as all my listeners know. I always talk about this. And so that sounds like horrifying to me, especially because everybody knows in Australia, every animal is deadly.
Right. So I'm gonna do my one little educational snapshot for the day, and then I'm gonna get out of Dave's way so he can talk about growing up in far north Queensland, which will invalidate exactly what I'm
everything.
The vast majority of Australia, and if Americans listening and people worldwide listening pick up one thing, Mimi, I know you'll know this because you've been here. The vast majority of the Australian population is incredibly urbanized. We live in big cities. Melbourne, where I live, has an urban footprint the size of LA. Most of us do not live out in country towns. And in fact, the experience of driving across the United States, which I've done a number of times, is really suggestive of how different that framework is, where you constantly drive into little towns of about 1,200 to 1,500 people. It's not like that here because the environment is very inhospitable. So everybody clusters in these big cities around the coast. And then it's some towns, admittedly, but often hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of just dangerous and deadly scrub. Now, the dangerous and deadly scrub exists, but I really need to emphasize, just for my own benefit, there are many Australians like myself who enjoy the city and are big wimps about nature. Please do not ask me to deal with your spiders or handle snakes or kind of blasely Steve Irwin through some kind of dangerous rural environment, because there is an assumption that creeps into conversations, particularly I must admit with American friends, that don't worry, the mere fact that I have to kick spiders out of the shoes will make me fine with everything, and I am not. There are plenty of effete, delicate Australians too, and we deserve our respect and a degree of cool when we are out in the environment.
Thank you for
I'm
dispelling that myth.
Yeah.
So
All
I grew
right,
up in
so
a small
Dave?
town. Yeah, I grew up in a small town in the rainforest in far north Queensland, hundreds of miles from anywhere. And I have spent my life slowly moving southwards to larger and larger cities. My wife is also from a small country town. So yes, it is a very different experience. No one would take us out to the bush for several days to see if we survived, because that was Tuesday. And
I was telling you because you did.
Yeah. In my youth, I was bitten by a spider, attacked by a cassowary, nearly drowned in a cyclone. These were all normal things.
Oh,
yeah.
of course.
Except
The
for the last
cassowary
one where
thing-
everyone went, "You're an idiot." Why were you trying to play on the beach during a cyclone? But yeah, a very, very different experience. I don't know if that instilled me with any particular love for treasure hunting. I think that's got other sources, like watching TV and seeing much cooler than people do it. But it certainly did instill some sort of love of landscapes, love of, I guess, country in that sense, which I find really odd now, because after 2 or so years of not really leaving the house in which I live, I've only now kind of come to realize that that's a thing I like and miss.
Yeah, I think we all are starting to realize a lot of things that we miss and have definitely taken for granted with after these last 2 years, but especially there's no traveling. So I have to ask and just pretend Greg's not here because he told us how he is as a collaborator and and overseer of comics.
You want me to leave?
No, not at all. But I'd love to hear, one, first of all, how you actually met Greg, because I know that I think I had read it somewhere, but I'd love for you to tell me about that. But also like your first impression of Greg, and then what led you to, yeah, and then what it's been like working with
Tell
him.
me.
So
the only good thing social media has ever done for me. Take it away, gentlemen.
Yes.
there's a general adage which I strongly support of never meet your heroes. It doesn't go well. I will say this is the exception to that rule. The idea of first impressions
So far.
is really weird in this context where I've been reading, like Robert has, Greg's work pretty much my entire adult life and more. So you have an idea in your head, a construct of a person. And then as you get to know them through kind of interviews and discussions like this, through just chatting about various things. Greg was writing Lazarus at the time, and we were, fairly deep down the rabbit hole of reviewing that. And we'd send him horrible articles about terrible things happening in the world and say, this really sucks. It sucks, but it might be useful to you. And he'd go, yep, but I'm depressed now. Thank you very kindly. And, through little interactions like that over time, we developed a relationship and a rapport. And at some point crossed that blurry, invisible line to friends. Which is something that I'm forever grateful the internet and social media let us do for all its terrible downsides.
It was 2015, right? It was Brisbane 2015 where I actually met you.
2015 is when we really started hanging out in earnest. I think you came. In fact, I think it's even earlier. I think 2013 we started doing reviews for Lazarus.
Yeah, because the book started in 2013. So
that feels right because we hit the premiere. And by about issue 4, I think the write-ups had attracted Troutman's attention first and foremost, because I vaguely remember talking to Eric before we spoke to you at some length. And then at some point, you and Michael had picked up on some annotations that we were doing because it'd come to your attention. And we'd started to talk about those and correspond a little bit. And I mean, we had a lot more time in various ways, but we were doing 6,000 words of notes per issue of what was then a 24 story page comic. That's right. God, I hope that's right. But I've lost count of original narrative page counts now that Lazarus has changed formats. But we then, off the back of doing, I think 6 or 7 of those, so that would have been early 2014, we did an interview. That interview was supposed to run much like this podcast for about an hour. And we sat around kind of shooting the breeze for about 4.5 hours. It became a 3-part over the course of a day. And by the end of that, we were kind of jumping off common reference points, and, just with some people, it comes really easy. I guess that's the secret to it. And during that conversation, we had talked about some hobby related stuff that we were all into. And then from there, I think a note went around saying, do you want to catch up and do this sometime, since you said that you've missed doing it. And from there,
we're talking about role-playing games.
Yeah, so I'm not self-conscious about this at all, but I just wanted to make sure we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, effectively, and which is how Dave and I met, give or take, system and framework, but effectively how we met. And so we were talking about that, and I asked Greg to join a game that we were doing online, and that sort of, I think, probably moved it from the quasi-professional boundary to the actually now we just hang out every few days boundary. And from there, it all gets messy, and lots happened during that time. Kids were born and grew up, and people moved cities, and then we were all able to get on planes back then in the before times. And so, you know, we went to Portland and Greg came to Australia, and, you know, the world's mixed and matched.
Yeah.
How is he as a collaborator is a very different question.
We love Greg. However, he says.
However, personally, he's great. Professionally, ...
No, I mean, we're very conscious. He's very he's unstintingly generous with his time and effort, and we are very conscious to try not to abuse that, because, you know, I'm going to give him a big head here, but he's a superstar of the medium. He is, and you know, I think the first job that we did doing some work actually on Lazarus, I suggested was like our first gig as a band was opening for the Beatles. Like, it was just because it was a murderer's row of top tier talent. And so while we have access to that great and juicy brain, I think the key component is we're always trying to tell him it's okay. We don't want to presume. And he very generously jumps in and goes, no, I'm happy to do it. He is, to our knowledge, either happy to do it or very good at faking it for the better part of a decade. To, you know, give notes and thoughts and counsel. And when you get to know somebody well, they're always better at calling you on your shit and giving you gentle praise where needed and robust encouragement where needed too. And so, you know, rabbi is probably the right term. You know, I do think that's accurate to what it is. It's much more.
I gotta jump in a little bit, because there is, and this is, I can't emphasize this enough. All right, this and you get into this, right? And I've seen it with Jen, right? With my wife, right? There is this, and I suppose it's endemic across any entertainment industry and probably any industry or any profession. There is sometimes the presumption that, well, you only got this because of the people you know, like the people who believe that my bride never wrote a comic until after I was established in comics and, you know, had become, quote unquote, you know, the guy who's writing detective. And that's patently not true, right? Nobody should walk away from this thinking, oh, he found these two neophyte writers, and because of the personal relationship was like, I will water them and tend this garden, and they shall turn into robust growing writers, and they'll be the real. These guys could write. I mean, they knew how to tell a story. And one of the things, and we've talked about this in the past, you know, in our epic marathon, somewhere in the last, like, what, how many now, 70 odd podcasts you and I have done, Mimi, or whatnot, we've talked about the fact that role-playing games are a narrative form, and they are a narrative training. And when you in particular are playing a lot via prose, you see writing, and then you read other writing. You know, I read other writing that these guys had done, and this was not an issue of being like, it's a great idea, but under no circumstances should you guys be allowed near a typewriter. This was literally oh no, you guys understand. You understand some of the things. There are things that can be taught, and there are things that have to be learned. And they had learned the things that needed to be learned. I can teach you how to format for a comic script, right? That's teachable. Arguing about the dynamic between Shahida and Ling, that's not a teachable thing, nor is it something that one should teach, because that's not my place. That's not my story. The story is the story they wanted to tell. And I really, like I said, I don't want, I would hate for there to be a presumption that that this went the other way around. It didn't. It didn't. This was an issue of going like, no, these are very good storytellers, and I want to see their story told. So in so much as I have a muscle that I can bring to bear on that, i.e. I can go to Justin and I can say, I know these two guys and they've got this idea for a story. Can I put them in touch with you?
Mm-hmm.
And then Justin interacts and says, I am down for that. I would love to do this. I am in the luxury position of then being able to go to Image and say to Image, are you willing to take a chance on this? And the greatest fortune I have right now is that my career has been such, and it doesn't hurt that The Old Guard was a movie and did very well for Image, that I can say that to Image and Image can go, yeah, this is actually a very low cost risk for us. We will undertake it happily. So I will fade into the background again and look pointedly at Dave, who's on mute.
That's a really good point, and it goes to something that we were talking about at the start of the podcast, right? And I don't want to undervalue the importance of ideas to storytelling, because obviously they are the center point, the foundation of storytelling. But particularly in comics, in my experience, right? But I'm sure everybody, LA-based listeners will doubtless know a gazillion baristas and waiters and whatnot who are screenwriters who are sitting on, I've got a script. Ideas are cheap. I don't mean, again, I don't want to disparage them, but having an idea is nothing. And I think Greg says in the introductions that Dave and I drop ideas all the time. Many of them are not winners. I want to be really clear about that too, but they come fairly thick and fast. What matters, the gap between an idea and producing something or entering into a medium is the work. You've got to have, to a degree, I guess, the knack, but you've also got to put the time and effort in. Like Dave and I were writing together off and on in various quasi-professional capacities, and not from 2004 onwards. So we had 9 years before we were doing reviews that caught Greg's eye, that we'd been working through. And if you want to talk about what happened between the gap between a vague idea of doing Compass when Disney bought Indiana Jones to 2021, it's on the shelves, is we had a good 13 years of learning to become better craftsmen and better writers and to do justice to the idea. So it's not the one thing that I would recommend that people take away from this is, even if you've got a friend who is somehow connected in an industry and you think you've got a good idea, I'm not saying the door closed behind us or anything like that, but it's not, don't go to people who you know and kind of go, look, I got this thing. Greg did lead on that to a large degree, but also had he not done it, we would have done it hopefully another way. And I like to think that we would have eventually cracked that market for good or ill, because we kept putting in work after work after work to get us up to a standard where it can stand on its merits.
I think that's very true. I think that of all the things I brought to it, the one thing in that regard that I brought to it is I was able to accelerate their publishing schedule.
Yeah, a bit of a shortcut, like you said. I mean, but any creative endeavor,
or a nitro
a little boost
on the car, whatever boost, you want.
Yeah.
I was able to give them a little accelerant.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. Like exactly what you're saying, Robert. There's so many great ideas, and so, I've dabbled in indie film, and it's like, yeah, well, it's great to have an idea, but until you actually finish a product and do it and actually have anything into completion, there's a huge gap in between that. And the fact that you have like this is like something to be unbelievably proud of, right? Because it's in the making, and that, impetus of an idea was so long ago, but, now we have like, it's tangible thing. So, so Dave, I want to give you your opportunity to talk about Greg.
Oh, Jesus.
Wow. I mean, how do you follow that conversation? He's okay, I guess. Seriously though, I'll talk about something different to the friendship, which is great, and
Yes.
the origin stories, which are misty and lost in time to my aging memory. And talk a little bit about kind of the engagement and what it's like to have Greg as a producer, which is it is, you know, we have a lot in common when it comes to tastes and interests. We have a lot different, you know, we have different kind of generational points of origin and sources for the sorts of things, particularly for things like adventure hunts, which date and age when it comes to what's considered cool, what's considered campy, what's considered, like, it's an ever-changing feast. And the one thing though that's always been really fascinating there is at the heart of all that, his objective is always to make sure that we understand that we're telling our story. It's really easy, especially when there's two of you writing and an artist with, you know, really good and very clear views to get lost on tangents. There was one version of this story which had detours into entirely different countries, and there was another one that had very expanded, like, Welsh political events, all of which would have been a waste of pages compared to what we actually use them on. And Greg's ability to go, is this actually what you want to do? And if so, tell me why, is brilliant. It's a really, I don't know, Socratic method of teaching and engaging and collaborating, which, you know, really helped, I think, make it the best version of the story it could be. And it's not probably a usual role to have another voice for that, but, you know, the editor's role in general is just so important in comics and in writing for exactly that reason, to just have someone who says, hang on, have you thought about this? Is this the best version of the story it can be? And Greg was definitely that for us.
Yeah.
Hey,
The moral of
I'm,
this is, if you want to become friends with Greg Rucka, you know, love
No,
Lazarus and get on
No.
board with that, and then interview him somehow.
No,
Because
the
three of
moral
us
the
sitting
story-
here
Yeah, I was gonna say,
have all gotten to know
we've
Greg through interviewing
done the
him.
Wait a minute,
commonality of
you're
the
right.
past.
I will say that, look, I've always been a fan of the editorial relationship. And I think that one of the first lessons I learned as I sort of turned my eye to becoming a professional writer was that when you are offering any sort of editorial service or any sort of critique or whatnot, your job, and I use job loosely, not as like a titled position, right? But when if you come to me and you say, this is the story I want to tell, you are not coming to me to have me say you shouldn't tell that story. That doesn't service anything, right? If I am going to provide good editorship, good producership, then the job is to say, if that is the story you want to tell, are these choices you are making in service of that? Are there better choices to make? Doesn't have anything to do with whether or not I agree with the story, right? I may find the story one that I have no interest in at all, and I can point to a long list of DC and Marvel movies, for instance, that fulfill that criterion, right? The question is not, is the story worth telling? You have decided this is the story you want to tell. It has merit to you. Then the question absolutely becomes, all right, literally, functionally, how do you accomplish it in the best way possible? What can I do to assist that? And, you know, we've had, Mimi, you and I have had discussions about the creative process and so on, but in the grand, that to me is, and that's always something to be really, to me, it's something to be very, very leery of. Somebody comes to you when you're working on it. If they had come to me and they had said, this is the story you want to tell, and I said, that's not the story you should tell, then I have overstepped, and what's the point in that relationship, right? Now, the questions that you may engage in may lead to the discovery that that is not the story, in fact, that they wanted to tell, right? As you refine it, you may go, oh, you know what? You're right. This doesn't work in this context. Maybe we're really trying to do this. That's an organic and helpful process. But to turn to somebody, you know, who says, I want to tell the story about, you know, the little boy who finds a shotgun and accidentally kills a squirrel, and then learns an important lesson about the sanctity of life. I have no interest in reading that story. I have seen that story and read that story 1,000 times, but if that's the story you're burning to tell, then I'll be there to try to, you know, okay, well, let's figure out the best way to tell that story. You know,
I mean, that makes me more concerned about the ubiquity of shotguns than the sanctity of squirrel life, which is a separate.
I think Mimi has heard me talk about that particular story, but I go to that one because I don't want to point to other mass media things that make me want to vomit in my mouth right now.
That'll be another hour. Thank you very much. Don't get Rucka rant started.
I do want to jump on that for one moment though, because there's something interesting that comes out of that goes to the point that you were making before, Mimi, in jest, right? Which is that we all started as Lazarus fans talking about ideas with Greg before we got to know him personally. There are writers who are confessional, who really tear themselves open and put all kinds of gory personal details on the page. And that is not how I would characterize Greg as a writer, or Dave, or I. But there is a distinction, and it's an important distinction, between being confessional and being honest. And one of the key principles that I've always found that resonates with me in Greg's work, and why I think it speaks to a lot of people, is that he is an honest writer fundamentally. And the reason that people can get together around the ideas of his work is, generally speaking, if you like the ideas in his work, you like the ideas of the man. There's no disingenuity there, right? Mm-hmm. And so the appeal, you may hate them. I know that Greg has detractors who do not enjoy his work at all, but in many times that is because
growing every day.
Yeah. But the point about that, right, is that what he was always an advocate for, and I will say as not neophytes, but as less experienced writers, or let us say writers who have had less of the benefit of both the positive and negative experiences that a life behind the pen will give, is that you can be driven by all kinds of factors to shy away from that honesty. The audience might not like it. It's not the way the pitch should be. Maybe it'll be more palatable if I do this. Maybe people will understand it better. Whatever it's going to be. And he was always an advocate, and has always been an advocate for the honesty of the book. The most common note we would get during its larval stages was, this doesn't seem to honestly reflect the people in the situation. And when I go to the point that I was making before about how the truth of these characters drives the fun, and this is all very highfalutin talk. Again, we should emphasize it's a fun book. This is not philosophy. You know.
Yeah, the characters in the scene are the dinosaur, the ghost.
But within that context, right, the best lesson I think that he had to teach was the ability to do that work honestly, to come by it honestly and share it in that context. And that's certainly what we've tried to do with this, and I suspect what we will try to do going on is appeal back to the honesty of the ideas and how they're communicated.
Yeah. Well, we are coming up on our hour, guys, but I wanted everyone to to maybe kind of talk last roundabout about Compass a little bit, and where listeners can find it, how they can keep reading it. And okay, because now we have this lovely trade here, and since neither of you can remember who wrote what, I'm going to read to you what one of my favorite quotes were from the book. And I hope I wrote it down right, because I'm usually like, on my iPad typing upside down or whatever. So I
Oh,
hope
that
I
was
don't
me.
misquote it, but it was totally, you know, for listeners, if the whole, you know, heroine, Indiana Jones, Mongols and Islamic female lead didn't catch you already, it is just a lot of fun. And like you said, it's an adventure book, and I think we all need to go on a little bit of adventure nowadays. We all need to have kind of that escape, but also just something that's just wildly entertaining, but like Greg said, well written. And then you can pick out the pieces where Greg was like, no, shame on you, you should have gone outside. Like, this is probably where he fixed that part. But I really love the line where and I'm gonna forget who said it, but they said, "We are too used to being wise to admit we are helpless." And I don't know, that really jumped out at me. And so I don't know who gets to take credit for that, but there's a lot of philosophy in here as well. As light and hearted and entertaining as it is, there's a lot of depth to the characters. And I'm in a book club, and I'm going to recommend they read this too. But like, one of the things that we were all just talking about was, you know, whether you're plot driven or character driven, or like what are the different, and I forget all the different, but there's like 4 different things. I'm super character driven. Like, I fall in love with characters, hence, you know, Forever and all of like the characters in Lazarus that you just love. And that to me is what I see reflected in kind of this dynamic, is like, clearly you're already like invested in, especially our 2 female leads, right? You're really invested in the characters. So I really enjoyed the 2 characters, and I'm totally invested in their journey. And so, you know, that kind of, for me, propels everything. So yay, Compass and Shahida and Lang.
I think, and I guess if we're going to wrap, I would leave with this. You know, we talk about the joy and the fun of the adventure. One of the things that I think all of us loved about like Raiders of the Lost Ark, things like that, is that for all of the glee in the adventure, there's always a smart through it, right? Like, the Indiana Jones movies are at their best when they are not talking down to the audience at all. When they embrace that these people are educated and intelligent protagonists, right? And for all of the, you know, tomb raiding, treasure hunting, you know, skull cracking fighting that's going on in Compass, Shahida and Ling are the smartest people in the books. And I love that. I just absolutely love that about it. You can find the, I mean, the trade is now available. You can order it through your LCS. You can find it online. It's available digitally on whatever Amazon is calling its platform now, and other digital platforms. But the trade is now out there, and it's available from Image. And yeah, if somebody tells you they can't get it for you, they're fibbing.
And I'll link all of that here as well in this podcast blog post for everybody. And then if you're watching on YouTube, it'll be on here as well, and you can see all of our lovely faces and our and our animation. But yes, I'll link all of that. Any final words from our creators, Robert and Dave?
Do you want to go first?
Yep,
You guys are so polite. No, after
yes, our manners. That's what we're known for. Yeah, so I mean, it's been great to talk. It's been great to see the faces of these 2 gentlemen, and of course yourself. Just, it's been so weird just kind of talking through text in the main for such a long period of time. But I mean, yeah, I'm really glad that the trade is out there. I'm hoping more people get to read it. I'm hoping it's not the last we see of Shahida and Ling. I think their frenemy relationship has more chapters left in it. Probably with some equally bizarre conceit that will sneak up on us 10 a.m. on some Sunday morning in the future.
Excellent.
I mean, the best part of when mass media is singing, when it's at its best, right, is, at least in my view, always when it dances on the head of the pin between the sublime and the ridiculous. And part of having very smart characters and then putting them in relatively absurd situations, and then grounding those absurd situations in quite detailed historical narrative, is that you get to ping back and forth between those points on the spectrum. And that tension is the part that I'm most excited about, that I hope people will be most excited about in the books. If you found that tension in anything that you've picked up, if you're like, I enjoy that sensation of being silly smart all at once. And we talk a bit when we put the book together about one of the things we really wanted to do is if anybody reads it and then goes back and goes, they made that part up, surely. And then they go look it up and they find that that part's real, then we're happy and we've done our job. And if that's an experience that your listeners are out there for, please pick up the book, give it a try. We think at least on that level, it should hit the beats, we hope.
Awesome. Well,
Agreed.
thank you all so much for taking time to have this conversation. It was great to meet you both. We've been in the chat and all of that. And so it's good to meet everybody. Dave, Robert, and Greg, have a lovely, lovely
you,
day
Mimi.
or evening or whatever time it is there. Lovely to chat, and hopefully we'll do it again.
Thank you very much.
Definitely. Cheers.
See you soon.
Bye.
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 That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.